Thank you, Nick, and thank you all for joining us. So as you all know, the Saudi kingdom is in the hands of a very ambitious millennial, 32-year-old Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS. Now, this is a man dripping with ambition and on a mission to sell to the world and his own citizenry a vision of Saudi Arabia, a vision of a Saudi Arabia that's more moderate, technologically advanced, and geopolitically powerful. And we see that vision come through in these incredibly ambitious reform plans. Now, will everything go according to plan? Of course not, right? Lofty vision goals come inherently with a lot of constraints, a lot of impediments, and that's really what we're here to talk about. But is MBS a man that you should take seriously and his reform ideas seriously? Absolutely. And so this is what we're going to get into over the next few minutes, beginning with the why now. Why should you take the Saudi reform proposal seriously, and what is the urgency behind those reforms? And so for that, we have to take a look at, of course, the fiscal picture and the pressure just weighing down on Saudi Arabia as the clock is ticking on these reforms. Matthew, how do you see the real urgency driving?
So if we look back at around where Saudi Arabia was, say the early 2014 period, Saudi Arabia had spent basically the previous decade just spending money, basically whatever it could. Oil prices were around $110 per barrel. They could spend on whatever they wanted to. They could still have a giant expenditure that was around $300 billion at one point and still have a surplus, actually. However, oil prices collapsed. They went down to as low as $26 per barrel within a couple of years. All of a sudden, they had to have put into place an austerity program. Their expenditure went down to as low as to now around $250 billion. So that's a 16% drop. That's not small. Right. And then they had a $100 billion deficit at one point. So you look at that. You think about Saudi Arabia having at one point $750 billion in exchange. That's down by a third. So if you think about all the things about oil prices now probably not going up anytime soon, or at least not back to where they were, you can see a real sense of urgency saying, okay, we have to do something because the old model, it was broken.
And so when we look at, for example, the reserve picture for Saudi Arabia and what they have to gauge, just because, of course, they're still very dependent on oil revenues. And so that has to be a driving factor to determine how much cushion do they actually have in their spending and to drive forward these reforms. How do you look at that reserves outlook?
So the reserves now are actually somewhat positive. So they have been able to put in a huge the austerity budget. They're actually coming out of austerity measures to a certain degree this year. They're still going to have a small budget deficit. Mm-hmm. But because oil prices are no longer around $30 to $40 per barrel, or even below 50 anymore, they're around 65 to 70. Saudi Arabia is actually in a decent position where they're actually seeing their reserves for the last 3 months finally starting to go up. So they're not declining anymore. They've been able to stop the bleeding, so to speak. So they're at least in a better place where they're more confident and more willing to actually not only implement the reforms that they've been trying to do, but they're in a place where they're not as concerned about the immediate risk. They can take a more of a long-term objective when they look at their reserves, at least.
Okay, and that's what we can see, in this chart. You can see that at $40 a barrel, they're clearly in the danger zone. Around $60 a barrel, which is really within the band we see now, you have the urgency behind the reform, but, they have a little bit of room. $80 is the much more cushiony
right, and Saudi would love for that to happen.
Can they count on it?
Well, that's the question. But if it does happen, Saudi Arabia, becomes a question about the sustainability of what they're trying to do, because oil prices have been low before. They've gone off on these kind of different reform agendas before. And like the 1990s, they had a very similar one. However, once oil prices started to rise again in the early 2000s, they stopped it. They just weren't willing to put through the political crisis, or the political crunch, or the political consequences face them, actually, in order to move forward. So they rolled back. The question here is, if prices go back, they probably won't go back to where they were. Do they slow down the reforms, and at what amount do they slow them down? But we haven't seen that thus far.
And when we look at, Emily, and the demographic picture in Saudi Arabia, that's another huge driver behind.
And I think what Matthew brings up, that right now, when we look at the history of Saudi Arabia and what they've done before, they've run after reform drives before. Yeah. But there are different pressures on Saudi Arabia right now that there haven't been in the past. We have, by some counts, over half the population is under 30. And there's a huge amount of young people in Saudi Arabia that are clamoring for jobs and that are looking for new opportunities. They're very connected to social media. They're very connected to technology. And they're looking for ways in which they can work in Saudi Arabia. And the government is scrambling for ways to make sure that they're employed and that they're satisfied and that they're on board with what Mohammed bin Salman is proposing for the kingdom moving forward. That's another driver for how the economy has to structurally change in order to allow for that to happen.
And these are all linked. So one of the things to really think about is that in the long term, population is growing. You think about where oil production is right now for Saudi Arabia, it's not really conceivable for them to be able to double oil production to match population growth. So the amount of revenue, even if oil prices go up per person, it's going to go down. And then if we think about also the longer term challenges to the oil market in general, electric vehicles, all of these things, they're coming. And and if you look at Mohammed bin Salman, he's very youthful. These are going to be challenges that if he becomes the king, it's likely he's going to be a king for a very long time. It's going to be his challenges regardless of the short-term oil dynamics. So this longer-term reform, it's a good idea actually to put it under somebody who can take that long view because it's his long view, it's his life.